Dan, thanks very much for joining us today and being here for our New York launch party at NASDAQ.
Yeah, in the cold.
Yeah, it's very cold. I think it's colder than the Alps when we go skiing out there this week. So we'll make a note to avoid sort of the January, February window here in New York. And
just have to the Alps.
Well, I mean, that's another option. Let's jump straight into it. I think, obviously, I've seen a lot of materials that you've been pushing out recently. A lot of data to get through. I'm sure we need far more than half an hour to dive into a lot of this. Some controversial sort of statements or themes in there which resonate and which I'm keen to dig into. But maybe let's start with this. There seems to be a softening, or at least a shift away from the very dominant ESG narrative that's put pressure on both the financial markets and industry participants during the COVID pandemic and the years that have followed. You said that investors are shifting from the broad and inconsistent ESG frameworks towards focusing on material, non-financial data that directly impacts long-term value creation and risk management. I'll come on to the financial markets, but firstly, how, in your opinion, have corporate sustainability and emissions priorities changed as a result of the election?
Yeah, I mean, certainly this administration focuses on different things than the prior one did, and change is probably not the word I would go for. That it's probably more evolves, right? Evolution. I mean, we have some recency bias, but we forget 7 years ago this was CSR, then it's called ESG, and it's called sustainability, and who knows what it'll be called. I think there is this with the Trump administration coming in, there is this reversion to the reasonable and to the pragmatic. Like, let's not make this harder than what it needs to be. With that, energy is also a really competitive space. So if there's non-financial material data points that help me better understand the competitive positioning of a company, I want to understand those. I want to understand those trends. I want to understand the performance. And so we don't necessarily need all this outside noise that was once there. And then let's be honest, like, there's been an inherent failure on behalf of the frameworks to standardize, right, to get a unified standard. So when you have that failure from a top-down perspective, I think that's the opportunity for companies to dictate more on their terms from a bottom-up perspective.
Okay, no, awesome. And you also shared that you're sensing a shift as you see US capital allocators return to the middle. Just a few examples that came up in your newsletters and research. The confluence of major US lenders exiting the Net Zero Banking Alliance, the Fed refusing to endorse the Basel Committee's proposal for mandatory climate risk disclosures for banks. Major US asset managers, including JP Morgan, State Street, Goldman Sachs, have left the green investing group Climate Action 100. These are major signals in the context of the past 10 years, which signal a return to the middle in how capital flows to the energy industry in the US. What are the main drivers behind this movement, in your opinion, and how is this likely to impact how capital allocators are going to go about setting out their capital allocation strategies moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, so once again, the macro has shifted, and then the mindset, the collective mindset is reverting much more to the practical. So when it comes to net zero, will some portfolios individually be able to attain net zero? Like, maybe, probably. From an aggregated economic perspective, are we going to attain net zero? No, right? And then you look at the macro, when you combine that with the macro perspective, everyone agrees that the next wave of economic prowess resides with generative AI, which, oh, by the way, requires an enormous amount of incremental power, which is going to have an impact and a ripple effect on the energy space. So if we just look at these things pragmatically, if we just look at them in terms of what economic reality actually entails, there's nothing wrong with pursuing net zero. I think that makes sense. I think decarbonization makes sense. But I also think investors don't want to necessarily miss out on return purely for the sake of just getting a certification or getting some sort of a label that they can utilize in social media or something like that.
No, it makes sense. And you're obviously a member of our advocacy committee. We ran our first capital committee meeting last month, and I think one of the key topics of discussion, sort of which is sort of pertinent given your comments, when it comes to attracting capital back to the energy space, was that the industry's lack of competitive returns over the last couple of years has meant that there is no FOMO, and that's a quote. A lot of institutional investors on the call were using the word FOMO. And I think that if people felt they were missing out relative to other industries, that would get things going again. I mean, what's your take on this, and what does the industry need to do to create more FOMO?
I agree. I mean, there's a couple different things. So, I mean, first and foremost, clearly you have to make money, right? No one wants to miss out on the opportunity of making a better return or achieving alpha within their portfolio. The other component is just don't embarrass your investors, right? Don't do anything that would put them on the front page. So part of that, the onus is on the sector themselves, because one of the things that we need to improve upon is just the quality of data. And frankly, the educational curve that exists, right? There's a lot of moving pieces in the regulatory world. And when an investor is confronted with such a confluence, as you accurately put, of all these moving dynamics, the natural tendency is just to hit pause and go find something else. It's a little bit less complex. So there has to be more of a unified narrative that helps the investors understand and connect the dots that generative AI can't experience success without the energy space. Agriculture can't expand output or have the technological efficiencies that they're experiencing without the energy sector. Healthcare, biotech, the list goes on. So much more of, hey, from a macro perspective, here are the opportunities that the United States can capitalize on. And oh, by the way, the energy space is going to play a crucial role in that. Who within the energy space does it the best? And more importantly, who can earn us an alpha that is far more attractive than what's readily available elsewhere in the market?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think something else which you wrote, which I particularly enjoyed, and I quote, "The return to the pragmatic middle is clear. Missed revenue and cash flow targets come with consequences, while missed carbon emissions typically don't."
Right.
From our perspective, if we're to have a pragmatic conversation, obviously with the brand Pragma, that's something that resonates. It's important to debunk the myth that oil and gas investing and energy transition investing are mutually exclusive. How can oil and gas companies go about focusing on their core competencies and prioritizing sort of generating returns, returning capital to shareholders without abandoning the push towards decarbonization?
Yeah, once again, I mean, we are very adamant that energy, quote unquote, transition, I would actually say expansion, but the T word, and then the legacy or the conventional oil and gas space are not mutually exclusive, because if you look at where all the innovative technologies and the functional technologies are coming from, they are predominantly coming from the oil and gas space. Now, what's interesting is you have a lot more participation from, let's call it the Silicon Valley and the technologists, which to me is actually a very bullish signal that very cool things are about to happen. And I think one of the things that the space, if we're being honest, has to do a better job is how are we adopting methane technologies, or how are we how is measurement technologies improving? How are we going to adjust to the European landscape where everything is measurement, verification, and quantification? So once the space adopts these technologies, which we're in the process of doing, and once the impact and the results of those technologies are realized, obviously the story becomes that much more enticing for trust to come back to the space.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think another theme to come out of last month's Capital Committee meeting was that the energy companies and investors alike, it's interesting, we had sort of groups from the US, from Europe, and I think there was a clear divergence between
Bloods versus Bloods.
but there's this clear divergence between sort of the ESG sentiment in the US and in Europe, and I think the election result is clearly a catalyst for the sentiment over here in the US. But you recently shared an article saying that European banks are reconsidering their membership in the Net Zero Banking Alliance following the exit of their US peers and Canadian lenders that have left the space. You also wrote that critics argue these groups often lack enforceable standards and have become increasingly fragmented. Do you see Europe following the same direction of travel that the US has, and what will it take? How does that situation play out?
I mean, I certainly hope that Europe takes a chapter out of the US book and says, yeah, we can't go down this road. Mostly just pragmatically speaking, you don't want to fall behind economically. Once economics has to be prioritized above else, right? If you don't have the balance sheet or the cash flow, you can't look at other endeavors, right? Without any money, there is nothing to necessarily do. And we're beginning to see the ramifications of that, the consequences. A lot of these data centers that are next wave generative AI data centers are not selecting Europe. You have this going on in Ireland, you have this going on in Germany, where Europeans are missing out on economic opportunity. And that has a ripple effect, right? That is going to adversely impact society over the next 10, 20, even 30 years. I also think that the Europeans, don't punch me, are 10 to prioritize compliance over innovation. And now with this geopolitical environment where there's this arms race to establish global dominance over the artificial intelligence market, you just have to reprioritize compliance and innovation. I'm not saying get rid of compliance, but you don't want to fall behind China, right? You don't want to miss out on economic opportunity. The only way, in a lot of ways, that you're going to facilitate that is if you have readily available power that's also affordable. So you can figure out how to decarbonize and you can have compliance infrastructure in place, but that can't necessarily come at the expense of just ignoring future economic growth.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's a lot to unpack, and we'll see which way or which direction the Europeans take. But again, I think if we focus on sort of AI data centers, anticipated power demand growth, particularly here in the US over the next 5+ years, you recently sort of shared a presentation where you argue that the global energy landscape will change drastically over the next 5 years, and the US is not currently well prepared to meet those anticipated energy or that anticipated energy demand. How will the energy landscape change over the next 5 years for generalist investors who may not be so familiar with the industry? And what are the biggest drivers behind that change? And what do you mean that the US is unprepared?
Yeah, I mean, so we spend, rightfully so, a substantial amount of time discussing sources of energy like natural gas, nuclear, hydrogen, what have you. What we don't spend, in my opinion, as much time on is transmission and distribution. The last time the United States had an upgrade to the transmission lines, I think I was born, right? It's been like 40 years. It's been a hot minute since we've had that. Even in Texas, the transmission lines in Texas are as old as the transmission lines in California. So this is not a state-by-state thing. This is a national thing. And when you have that in place, and then as we've been talking, the theme of generative AI, there is an arms race to establish global dominance in the AI sphere. And China doesn't have to go through all the bells and hoops and all the shenanigans, bureaucratic shenanigans. If they want to build a data center, they're going to build it and they're going to use coal, right? And they have an advantage from a timing perspective. In the United States, if we just look at the timeline, you can build a hyperscale data center in 18 to 24 months, but it takes like 3 to 5 years to build a thermoelectric power plant. And then when you tap in, what it will take to upgrade transmission lines, that could be 7, 8, 9 years. So we don't necessarily have the luxury of time on our side. That means from a preparation standpoint, this administration has to be very focused on permit reform, has to expedite projects. We don't want to fall behind in this arms race purely because there's a bureaucracy that we have to deal with, right? This is not necessarily something that we would like to do. This will determine the balance of economic power globally for the next century. And if we fell behind because there's some added paperwork that we had to do, like that's frankly ridiculous.
Yeah, and no, it makes perfect sense. And I think it's not just transmission we need to look at, it's also water, power. These are obviously interconnected. I think they're probably factors that are overlooked in the conversation. Everyone thinks about where's the new supply coming from. There are these other sort of components that are critical and need to be addressed. And the US must address both to avoid vulnerabilities. What vulnerabilities could the US be exposed to? What are the consequences of failing to address these areas correctly? And what investment opportunity does this present for potential investors?
Yeah, I mean, just to expand upon, transmission and distribution, clearly, upgrading, retrofitting, and modernizing our grid and transmission and distribution is vital. But the wild card in this entire equation is water, right? We can build stuff theoretically. We could build it really quick. It's not like you don't just produce more water. It is what it is. Thermoelectric power plants will remain dominant sources of energy and power. They are heavily reliant on water. When you look at semiconductor manufacturing, once again, one of the most water-intensive businesses on the planet. And then when you tie in just how reliant other sectors are on water, and then with all this economic growth that we're having, the one thing that people don't necessarily realize is that the state of water within the United States is pretty dire, right? West Texas, constantly in drought. You have Southeast, predominantly Arizona, where they're reshoring semiconductor manufacturing. Not great. We have a variety of EPA water violations where these water infrastructure systems are just not scoring very well. So if we don't up the game with our water stewardship and our water management, even if we want to expand our prowess economically, that could be the culprit that holds us back if we don't manage it in a way that it should be managed.
No, absolutely. And again, that's a topic we could talk about for hours. We don't have time. I'm sure we can get some slides to share with this or include in the video. But something obviously which has dominated conversations over the past couple of years is that debate around emissions. Right. I think there's been this ideological viewpoint that the world can just ease itself off fossil fuels over a couple of years and convert entirely to renewables or alternative forms of energy. That presents its own issues. There's obviously reliability issues and intermittency issues, but I think something that's overlooked are the emissions profiles of the supply chain, and obviously sourcing critical minerals, metals, so on and so forth to drive some of these transition technologies. I saw a pretty bold headline on one of your reports recently that caught my eye. American coal is cleaner than Chinese solar.
Sure is.
How did you come to that conclusion, and do you have data that can back up that claim?
I absolutely have data. I mean, what's interesting is your point on the debate on fossil fuels. I've actually found that it's gotten a little bit easier now that Landman has come out this series. I haven't watched any of it, but I mean,
I haven't either, but it's on my radar.
My Uber driver over here today saw the boots and he's like, "Where are you from?" We got to talking. He's like, "Oh, do you watch Landman?" I was like, "You're like the 1,000th person." But this curiosity that I just personally had regarding wind and solar, once again, for me, when you go through the data in its entirety, it makes more sense to me, at least, and I think this is picking up popularity with the general consensus, that it makes perfect sense for China to promote wind and solar because they own 80%-ish of that supply chain. Why wouldn't they want to expand upon what they have such a dominant monopoly over, whereas we're obviously natural gas and nuclear dominant? So digging into that data, what you find is that not only does China have a monopoly over the supply chain required for wind and solar, but the manufacturing of wind and solar requires extreme heats that can only be provided by coal. So we are importing wind and solar technologies that are manufactured in China that are created in facilities that are powered from coal-fired power plants. And then you get into the argument, because we have coal clients, like we're proponents of coal. The characteristics of American coal versus Chinese coal are completely night and day. And then when you tack on the focus on environmental controls, health and safety, human rights, all the above, it paints a much different picture than what's being portrayed in the consensus, right? If you look at the entirety of the supply chain, it is very clear that China does not want to rely on any other nation, state, etc. for their sources of energy. And because they have readily available access to the supply chain, of course they want to expand their energy mix. And then in the United States, it doesn't necessarily make sense that if you look at our profile objectively, we've been decarbonizing for 40 years, right? Our emissions profile has gone down drastically, and it has not come at the expense of expanding GDP per capita. So when we look at the holistic picture, particularly this dichotomy between oil and gas and wind and solar, I think oil and gas is disproportionately, quote unquote, penalized for their emissions profile, and far too much credit is given for the, quote, green attributes of the wind and solar technologies.
Okay, makes sense. We'll have to dig into the data and see those slides. I guess two questions left. Just digging on sort of the US being natural gas and nuclear sort of heavy, and that being dominant over in this part of the world. How important are these two energy sources going to be in meeting growing energy demand and doing so in a way that provides reliable, affordable, and low carbon baseload power to both America and to its allies?
Yeah, I mean, just looking at sort of case study, right? Let's take Virginia, for example, and we've utilized this example countless times, but 70% of the world's internet traffic flows through one county in Virginia, right? It's commonly referred to as Data Center Alley. And you look at their energy mix, it's 60% natural gas, 30% nuclear, and at any given time, 8 to 10% of renewable. You contrast that with the energy mix in the United States, the national energy mix, 40% natural gas, 20% nuclear, and 10 to 20% renewable at any given time. So just back of the envelope math would say, well, we have to go from 40% natural gas to somewhere in the neighborhood of 60% natural gas. And then we have to go from 20% nuclear to 30% nuclear. If we want to facilitate generative AI, there is an existing blueprint to copy that would say this is probably the way to go. And then if you just look at demand, you look at Winter Storm Uri, for example, and this is almost cliche at this point, but the resulting analysis that FERC released, it's like 95 pages. You throw it in a chat GPT and you give me like the top 10 points and you read it. 8 of those points essentially say we need to expand our infrastructure related to natural gas, right? The fact that we didn't have a collapse on the grid purely because it warmed up a little bit on Christmas Day, that's probably not the best strategy to abide by, right? You don't want a strategy is like, man, I hope it gets warmer, like that'd be awesome, and that way we won't get in trouble. Like, no, you have to prepare for this. And even in Texas, I think it's timely today. Today was the first time in history that the energy demand hit 80 gigawatts. So that's all-time high. The anticipated power demand in the next 5 years for Texas is 150 gigawatts. Are we going to build a nuclear plant in Texas in the next 5 years? Nope. Like, can we rely on wind and solar? Like, nope. Like, almost by default, and lucky for us, like, the answer is natural gas. So you think about this strategically, it's natural gas buys us time to get more nuclear implemented into the mix and do it in a very efficient manner. And we can still have all these positive attributes of decarbonization, affordability, reliability, and frankly, geopolitical standing, right? Europe wants LNG, they want natural gas. So it is almost the best of both, or not both worlds, like all these worlds. It is a fantastic solution.
No, it makes perfect sense, and it's very eloquently put. So I guess final question, we're obviously delighted to have you involved with Pragma on the advocacy committee. Why did you choose to join the advocacy committee?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I really appreciate and respect the message, right? It's aptly put, Pragma. Like, we've been pushing pragmatism for the last half decade. So just, conceptually, there's an alignment there. But I think what I appreciate the most is the variety of perspectives that you implemented into the mix. Like, what you could have made this like the echo chamber of all echo chambers, and you did it. So, for me personally, I'm always seeking new opinions. I always want to learn, and the individuals that you've put in place, like, I'm constantly learning from them. Don't necessarily agree with them all the time, but I'm still learning from them. So I really appreciate the fact that you've collected all these really smart, capable, experienced people, and then from the mindset of attack, like, let's bring the narrative to the general public, right? Let's stop this reactive, sitting in the corner, head down, and just, it is what it is. Like, no, like, there's a really good story to tell. Let's utilize this collection of resources to go tell it.
Brilliant. Well, Dan, thanks very much for your time. Great to have you along, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Absolutely.